This is a slightly different procedure, so let me start with a little bit of procedure and say I'm now convening this meeting of the City of Portland Budget Committee, which will proceed as a work session this morning and then continue to tomorrow, Wednesday, May 20th at 6:30 p.m. for a public hearing. And I want to start by thanking Commissioner Fish for this suggestion of having a council work session on the proposed budget in order to improve understanding among members of the council and with the community, and be both clear and transparent about where we're heading in the development of the budget. Some ground rules and process points I want to make. It's obviously important for us in a work session and here with our advisors, both from the community and from the budget office and from our bureaus, to work and to keep the perspective of being a board of directors. Look at the budget changes in light of not only the available new funds, but the entire $3.68 billion budget. This is a work session, so the council won't be making decisions today. The purpose, again, of the work session is to answer questions and to get into depth on issues that we want to delve into. I'm going to take into account what we hear from each other today and from the community tomorrow in the hearing, and produce some additional proposed amendments to my own proposed budget in time for us to take them up next week. So obviously all of us are still looking for places that we think the budget needs adjustment, and I am too, and I'll try to consolidate the sense of the council as much as possible into a set of consensus amendments that I hope we will all like. I want to again make a request that we not propose any amendments after Monday at noon, since we vote Wednesday. So try to get everything on the table in time for people to actually consider and deliberate. Andrew, in a few minutes, will set the context and walk us through the mayor's proposed budget. We have bureau directors and some subject matter experts here for information to answer questions from council and ensure that we have the information we need. First, though, I want to just restate some overall higher level points that I think are important about this budget. For the third year in a row, this proposed budget reflects, I think, Portland's values and focuses on basic services like streets and housing, on public safety, and on investing in our kids. The proposed budget includes $30.4 million in new funding for basic services, including almost $20 million in transportation projects, $6 million for housing and homeless services, and of course that $6 million is atop almost $90 million that's already in the city budget for housing from all sources, taking our housing commitment up to almost $100 million. I've allocated $9.6 million for public safety and emergency preparedness, including funds to begin the renovation of the Portland building and to retain the 26 firefighter positions that have been bridged over from our very difficult budget in 2013 to halfway through this next fiscal year with a federal grant. I've also prioritized the effort to alter the relationship between the police and the community, and that therefore this budget invests in analysts for the Department of Justice settlement, in domestic violence intervention, in gang enforcement, and in the community outreach, compliance officer, community liaison function under the Department of Justice settlement. In fact, when we get to the sheet here of total bureau budgets and additions, you'll see a shocking increase in the budget for the mayor's office of 30.7%. That's entirely funding for the COCL and the COAB, so not for new staff positions in my office, in case anyone misunderstood that. I've also proposed to invest about $4 million in funding for our youth, to expand parks programs, maintain funding for TriMet bus passes and summer internships, and partner with Concordia University to provide continuous support for children attending Fabian School in Northeast Portland. So again, I will, after this work session and after tomorrow's public hearing, propose some additional amendments that capture priorities and concerns I've heard from council members. I also want to encourage each of us, not just today in the work session, but over the next couple of days, to look at the budget as a whole, look at the proposed allocation of additional general fund dollars, and then also look back into our bureau budgets and see if there are any reallocations that we want to propose within the budgets under our individual leadership. I'm doing a little of that. I see a couple of opportunities where I might want to reallocate some things within the base budget, again, not talking about new funding, but looking back into the corpus of the overall budget. Because this was a budget where we've had the luxury of adding to our programs and services, maybe we don't feel quite the same pressure to look back into the base budgets, but it's always an appropriate thing to do. And I'm taking a couple looks at things within my portfolio where I think that might be appropriate. And again, we'll bring those amendments forward to my colleagues as I ask us all to do. So with that, again, thank you all for this process. Thank you, Commissioner Fish, for the suggestion, and then a special announcement from Commissioner Fish before we begin.
Thank you, Mayor.
Is there one of these that works? Oh, yeah, and the new sound system is.
Is this work? So, Mayor Hales, thank you for embracing this work session. It turns out that most jurisdictions in Oregon, after the mayor or the presiding officer produces a budget, has a work session where the budget is discussed with his or her colleagues. And when I learned that from the CBO and had a conversation with Andrew Scott, it seemed like potentially a very beneficial addition to the extensive public scrutiny that we already have built into the budget. I hope if this turns out to be valuable, this becomes a regular feature of the budget cycle, because I think it has great promise. And thank you very much. I also, since we have a lot of the extended Portland City Hall family here today, I want to take this moment to introduce the newest member of our family, the new director of the Bureau of Environmental Services, Michael Jordan. Michael, would you stand and be recognized? And as we welcome Michael, we also say thanks to Jim Hagerman, who did double duty the last few months, did not seek that appointment, but has served the Bureau and the city wonderfully. And so we're grateful for the transition and the leadership that he's provided, and we look forward to Mike Jordan joining us as of June 1st.
I have actually a comment, Mayor, and that is to remind us all that since we're not taking public testimony today, we're not deliberating and we're not making decisions, so we're airing our opinions but not coming to consensus.
Great, thank you. Mayor and Council, I'm Andrew Scott, the City Budget Director, and I'm going to do just a little bit of an overview, go into a little bit more depth than the Mayor did in terms of what's in the proposed budget, and specifically spend some time walking through the general fund surplus allocation, and then at that point sort of open it up for conversation again with the Budget Committee. Again, just to remind everyone, this is the approved budget work session. We are here with our citizen advisors, and thank you for making the time to meet with us today as well. And the purpose, again, is to discuss this proposed budget and any potential changes in advance of the May 27th vote by Council. And again, on May 27th, Council is scheduled to approve the budget. Just as a reminder, it then goes to the Tax Supervision and Conservation Commission. They'll have 20 days to approve the city's budget. It then comes back for a final adopted budget vote on June 18th. So that's the remainder of our budget process. And as the Mayor mentioned, we do have a budget hearing tomorrow night in Council chambers at 6:30. In terms of the overall context, again, of the 15-16 proposed budget, and again, that's what we're talking about today. They're having conversations since the Mayor released his budget, but the documents you have before you today reflect those proposed budget decisions. It is a $3.7 billion gross budget. That number does include a number of interagency transfers, and so when we back those out, it's about a $2.9 billion net budget. So again, that's the total city budget overall. Of that $2.9 billion, $1.8 billion are Bureau expenditures. So these are what we think of, I think, most of the time. When we think of a Bureau budget, we think of the personal services, the materials and services, and the capital spending. The remainder is made up of debt service and contingency, and again, those fund transfers to get to those total dollar amounts. Specifically within that, again, $3.7 billion gross or $2.9 billion net budget, we have a general fund. The general fund this year is about $576 million in total. That includes both discretionary and non-discretionary. And again, just as a reminder, a number of general fund bureaus have what we consider non-discretionary general fund resources. A good example of this are parks fees that they receive at their community centers. Those are general fund dollars, but they're not discretionary in the sense of they don't get allocated elsewhere, they get allocated to parks programs. So the total general fund is $576 million. Of that, $484.5 million is the general fund discretionary pot. And again, that's what we focus a considerable amount of our budget time and discussion on. And again, just the final reminder, the City Budget Office issued the final forecast at the end of April, and it does show a surplus of about $50 million, $49 million to be exact, broken down. $13.1 million of that is ongoing funding, and $35.9 million of that is one-time. So again, a very significant surplus. We've been trying to go back to see if it's the most significant surplus, and that can be a little bit difficult, but I think it's safe to say it is definitely one of the largest, if not the largest surpluses we've had in the last 20 years or so. Specifically within the proposed budget, and the mayor covered a little bit of this in his opening remarks. But again, in the basic buckets that the proposed budget was divided into, there's and in terms of how that surplus was allocated, a little over $30 million going into basic services. This included a large chunk into transportation of about $20 million, housing about $6 million, some parks capital projects, and other things. Public safety and emergency preparedness received just under $10 million, or about $9.6 million. Again, this included funding for 26 firefighters in 15-16, and 13 of those funded ongoing into the future. It included funding for the Portland building to get started on the Portland building renovation. It included funding for the DOJ settlement implementation, both analysts at the Bureau and, as the mayor mentioned, the COCL and the COAB. A CAD server replacement at BOEC. And finally, ongoing funding for Hooper and Cheers. Those who've been around for a while know that we've serially one-time funded those programs for a number of years, but the mayor's proposed budget does get those into ongoing, both Hooper and Cheers funding. And the final sort of chunk of funding was $4.1 million for kids. And again, the main pieces of this were parks programs for youth, and again, bus pass funding as well. In terms of the proposed budget, infrastructure overall was $19.3 million. These are infrastructure maintenance and replacement projects, $19.3 million. That is about $1.4 million more than was required under the City Council resolution. So again, the City Council resolution would have been just under $18 million. The proposed budget includes $19.3 million for those infrastructure projects. And finally, in terms of FTE, it's worth noting the proposed budget total FTE would be 5,793. That adds about 134 positions in the proposed budget. But again, for context, if you look back historically in fiscal year 08-09, so sort of the last fiscal year budget before the recession and the reductions, the city had about 6,035 FTE. So we're still down over 200 FTE from again, where we were pre-recession. In terms of the documents that you have before you, everyone should have a packet, and I'm going to walk through that at this point. You have a one sheet. It's a 2015-16 proposed budget general fund surplus allocation. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit more detail in just a minute. You have a legal size sheet, a color copy of a 15-16 proposed budget changes. What this spreadsheet does, or at least attempts to do, is for every bureau, show what their base budget is, broken down between general fund and non-general fund bureaus. Shows what the decision packages in the proposed budget are, again, broken down between general fund and other funds. And then finally, what the total budget is for that bureau, again, broken down between general fund and non-general fund, and the percent change. Again, as the mayor talked about, we often focus, and the media often focuses on the surplus and the $50 million, which is certainly important, and I'm going to spend some time on that as well. But again, we have this overall $3.7 billion city budget, and it is worth, I think, noting where those resources go at that overall bureau level. Behind that, you have a decision package tracker. You've all had this and seen this before, but again, this is just another copy of the decision package tracker for the proposed budget, and it includes every decision package that was submitted by the Bureau, and then the mayor's decisions on those packages as well. And then behind that, again, a summary of those new positions that I mentioned that are being added in the proposed budget, and then a historical sheet, again, showing the changes in positions back from 08-09, both graphically and then by bureau behind that. And that document was provided back in February as well in your binders, but just repeating that here.
How much do we have in contingency, both ongoing and one time?
So the mayor's proposed budget includes $2.46 million in ongoing, in contingency, all of which is ongoing.
So nothing left in the one-time money? It's like,
For contingency,
well, as far as allocating the one-time money, it's all in the
it
budget?
is all out. Yes, the $35.9 million is all allocated, and that's a great segue. Thank you, Commissioner. So going back then to the first sheet.
Excuse me, isn't contingency supposed to be 10% of the general fund?
No, so our general fund reserve is 10%. And so our general fund reserve is funded at 10% and maybe even a little bit over 10% at this point in time. Again, that reserve is budgeted separately from contingency and in a separate account from the general fund as well. And the city hasn't actually ever tapped our reserves back from when they were created at that level. So
Follow-up question. You said that it's 2.46 million ongoing,
yes.
and historically, have we, typically, has it been ongoing money, one time, or both?
We always, in our forecasting, our 5-year forecast, assume an ongoing amount for contingency that gets plugged in there every year. That amount then is spent on a one-time basis during the course of the year. So for instance, if there are one-time emergency needs or unexpected costs, we would allocate that out to those costs. But it's ongoing from a forecasting perspective, so the next year it gets replenished. The contingency number generally was lower. It was about 1.4 million for a number of years, and the mayor's first budget, when he came in, increased it up to $3 million ongoing. And then this last year's budget, we reduced it a little bit to fund some other ongoing costs down to 2.5 or just under 2.5.
If the council wanted to switch out a one-time with an ongoing expenditure, is that something you frown on with respect to the contingency?
Well, council can, of that 2.46 million, council could either reduce it on an ongoing basis and allocate that ongoing funding elsewhere, or you could grab it on a one-time basis in 2015-16, and then in 2016-17 it would go back to the previous level. So returning to the 2015-16 proposed budget general fund surplus allocation, this one-page sheet, we find this sort of the easiest way to track where the general fund surplus has been allocated in the proposed budget. What you'll see on the left-hand side is, again, where all the ongoing funding, the $13.1 million of ongoing funding went. On the right-hand side, you can see where the $35.9 million of one-time funding was allocated. I'm going to go through sort of the big items here. And then, again, if you have any specific questions as I'm going through it, feel free to stop me. I will either answer them or we'll bring the Bureau up if it's a question about a Bureau allocation, or we can wait till the end as well.
Mayor, this is a protocol question, so I think it'd be good if you decided it. Andrew's prepared to go through each line item and take questions as they come up, or there may be a sense of the council they want the whole presentation and come back to questions, but it's really, he's prepared to do either one.
Strong preference either way. So why don't you try to make it through?
Okay, well, and I don't have much of a presentation. It'll be a sentence or two sort of on each one explaining it. So starting on the ongoing side, you can see, again, $2.6 million, a little bit less than that for the Portland building. Again, this is the approximate debt service on a 20-year financing, again, setting that money aside ongoing. And some of this will also be used to help with the cash payment, again, under city financial policies for these large capital projects. We try and have 5% of cash in the game as well. It's worth noting that separate from this general fund allocation, OMF has also proposed, and this is in the mayor's proposed budget, $3.5 million, I believe, out of existing major maintenance funding that would also go towards planning this year on that Portland building project. There's $1.364 million for an ongoing funding for the Out of the Mud initiative. Again, this is to begin making progress on the unpaved streets in the city of Portland. And I think there are still some details to be worked out on the program in terms of whether it's an LID subsidy and at what level. But again, this is ongoing funding to get the city started on that process of paving those unpaved streets. $1.2 million in DOJ agreement funding, and this includes, as I mentioned, both analysts within the Police Bureau as well as the COCOL and COAB funding. $1.4 million for fire positions. This is enough funding to keep all 26 of the grant-funded firefighters on board in 2015-16, and since it is ongoing and would continue on into 16-17, that's enough to keep 13 of the firefighters on board. Again, council would need to make that decision in 16-17 about the other 13 that are not ongoing funded. Parks programs for youth, $2 million again, and there's been some, the mayor released some details around this in his press conference, and I know Parks is here as well if council has questions about that. But again, these are programs at the Parks Bureau to help at-risk youth and give more access, again, to our parks facilities. Back in January or perhaps February, the mayor talked about $15 an hour for city employees and certain contractors. That's estimated at about $900,000. So again, that is included in the budget as well. I mentioned the Cheers and Hooper being converted over to ongoing funding out of the serial one-time. It was one of the, there are still a few serial one-time, but we've made huge progress from the over $20 million that was on that list as of a couple years ago to just a very small amount. And this was another large piece that had been sitting there that we're able to convert over to ongoing now. And then the other mayor's decisions, $2.7 million. Again, I'll go briefly through those. There's an equity and civil rights enforcement position in the attorney's office. There's an emergency communications supervisor assigned to operations in the Office of Emergency Communications. Performance management office in the city budget office. Thank you very much. There's a small amount going back into contingency, $13,400, again, into ongoing. This is sort of a balancing issue there. $23,192 for an international relations. I believe that's the Hatfield Fellow in the Office of Government Relations. There's an MWESB compliance position in OMF within procurement services. The East Portland Action Plan, $300,000 is being converted into ongoing funding. So again, that has been serial one time for a number of years, being converted over into ongoing funding. A small amount for a position reclass in ONI, again, just due to a position transfer and a needed reclass there. $98,657 for ONI. This is for an RFP to expand the Diverse Community Leadership Program. Again, this is part of the discussion that we'd had, again, to allow ONI to go out and add one more group to that DCL program. $567,669 for Parks fountain maintenance. Again, council gave Parks the maintenance of the fountains in the current year, the 14-15 budget, and then this would adequately fund the ongoing maintenance of those fountains into the future years. There was funding included both for the seasonal park rangers conversion and the maintenance workers conversion, again into full-time positions there. Operations and maintenance, $505,659. It's worth noting, if you look to the right, just a couple lines down, you'll see that funding is offset. Again, the city's existing O&M policy is that we will fund the O&M or set aside the ongoing funding for the O&M for any parks that, or actually any facilities citywide that are going to be contracted during the fiscal year. So again, Parks expects to come back to council during 15-16 with requests. These parks will not be open, however, in 15-16, which is why you see that offset. So essentially that creates a little bit of one time to spend, but we're setting aside that ongoing money for the future. But again, the purpose of that is so that council during the budget process can have a conversation about whether we're comfortable with that ongoing amount, that $505,000, because again, to the extent council's not comfortable, now would be the time to talk about parks expansions and whether we can afford the ongoing O&M for those expanded services. Domestic violence restraining order team in Police Bureau, $386,000 is funded. There's a gang enforcement team crime analyst, a little over $100,000. A small adjustment in the materials and services for the Office of Youth Violence Prevention Program. An increase in the Future Connect scholarships, and again, this $129,000 is an increase on the base, which is a little bit more than $400,000 for those scholarships. And finally, a small true-up in the city's membership and dues to make sure we can pay all the membership and dues that we currently have. Maybe with that, I'll stop on the ongoing side, or I can walk through the one-time as well.
Could you talk a little bit more about the FM contingency, 13,000? I know it's a small amount. I wasn't clear on what that was.
Basically, what we do is at the end of the balancing effort, if there's some money left, which was about 13,000 there, rather than trying to stick that into another package, basically we'll put that into contingency. And part of that came out of there was a last-minute package on the memberships and dues. We found that we could fund that should have been funded as the overhead model. So the resources that freed up, it was kind of at the last minute, we put that into contingency. It can be reallocated for anything that it needs to be
I just want-
reallocated for. But
It could be reallocated, because I know that there are still a few hands out from agencies into, or 13,000 in contingency, when they might actually be able to use it for something that the city would want, might be something, a conversation with having.
Mayor, I have a couple of questions. Andrew, on the Portland building, we're still sort of working through the details of the option of rehabbing the existing structure, the cost, and how we pay for it. Does this expenditure commit us to a particular path, or is it just a prudent set aside towards what we think is the likely path that the council will take?
I think the answer is the latter. Council will need to take a number of actions in terms of actually committing to that course. What this does is it sets aside funding, though, that's adequate to take us down that road as those decisions come up.
My understanding, and Fred and his team are here, but we think this is the likely path. We're pretty sure this is the cost, but we're within the cost parameters of what we're going to have to do to repair the building, and this is sufficient to cover the general fund portion of that cost. So we haven't committed as a council yet that we are indeed doing this construction program to that building, but this puts the funds in our ongoing budget to cover the cost, assuming that we do make those decisions.
Thank you, Mayor. Out of the mud, I think you said earlier that about 40% of the mayor's proposed budget goes into streets and street pavement. Does that include out of the mud, or is that separate from the 40%?
Of the surplus of the $50 million, about $20 million goes to transportation overall, which includes street paving and safety, as well as some of their capital projects as well. And so that does include out of the mud initiative, yes.
And, I'm sorry.
I just want to clarify the answer to Commissioner's question. Is the council's policy of the 50%, does that include the out of the mud or not?
It does not. Yeah.
So we could hit the 50% rule on one-time money without the out of the mud contribution.
That's right. Because it's not one time.
Not one time. I just had a technical question on the other mayor decisions, the equity and civil rights enforcement position. What would be the functions of that position, and is it somehow linked to what we might do on Ban the Box?
I'm going to allow the city attorney to answer the question.
Good morning, Council. Tracy Reed, Portland City Attorney. We see this position doing a kind of a broad array of functions, one of which would be Ban the Box and other related initiatives council might choose to undertake to enforce, broadly speaking, the civil rights of Portlanders. Other work that we see this position doing is working as another support attorney on the DOJ COCL project, working on a variety of both access to justice issues and community justice issues. So ensuring that we're not only defending the city's legal rights when we have litigation brought against us or claims made against us, but that we're also working to ensure that we as a city are fulfilling all of our legal obligations to meet and adhere to our citizens' civil rights and legal rights. Some of those are Title VI. This position will work closely with the Office of Equity and Human Rights on any Title VI and ADA Title II issues, and other, making sure that as we do our legal advice that we're helping the city achieve the policies, the binding policies that council has adopted to ensure equity throughout the city.
So Tracy, and there is a growing body of laws that we're required to enforce or track. So
Absolutely.
ADA, fair housing, the whole cluster of laws that the Office of Equity looks at, and on, the fair contracting work that the mayor has launched. So there's a ton of work. Would you still be seeking this position even if the council ultimately decides that their preference is we contract with Boley for administrative enforcement?
Oh,
at Ban the Box?
absolutely. Absolutely. We see that as one small portion of the work that is being done. And I believe that it's a better policy choice, or I would recommend that council look closely at if we are going to continue to have independent rights that the council is creating that are different than the state-created rights, that we as a city need to develop an enforcement mechanism for those. But even if the council makes a different choice on that, which of course it is ultimately the council's decision, there is a lot of work in the areas that I just mentioned. Commissioner Fish mentioned another one. We've got a lot of affirmatively furthering fair housing obligations coming at us down the pike that, as the name suggests, requires affirmative work to do to make sure that Portlanders are receiving fair housing and that we're addressing housing inequities and on people based on income, communities of color, that nature. So really that is what I see as the focus of this position, is doing that work throughout the city. Now, a lot of our lawyers do that kind of work, and a lot of our lawyers will continue to do that. But having a point person and someone who that is their expertise and who can coordinate that work and can coordinate a community justice work group around those kinds of legal issues will be, I think, incredibly beneficial.
So while you're here, Tracy, is the paralegal position funded at this point or no?
At this point in time, it is not.
How much is that?
About $118,000.
Thank you.
Sure. So I'll go ahead and walk down the one-time column as well. Again, $35.9 million of one-time. And you can see, as I mentioned, that the bulk of it is going for infrastructure projects, and a little bit more than the 50%. So specifically, and within the Bureau of Transportation, a little over $9 million for street paving projects. In addition, there's another $8.8 million in other transportation capital projects and Southwest Corridor funding. Parks Capital, there's about $3.3 million of those projects, and that includes things like the Mount Scott Community Center HVAC replacement, the Scavone Stadium lighting repair, Lansu Chinese Garden reconstruction on the Lake Zither there, Charles Jordan Community Center roof replacement, and a couple other smaller items as well in the Parks Bureau. There's the community-aided dispatch server replacement in the Bureau of Emergency Communications, $1.4 million. 5.9, almost $6 million in housing, and that goes to a few different packages. There's $850,000 for preventing displacement and home retention. There's a little bit to support the Home for Everyone Coordinating Board position. $500,000 for veterans rental assistance. $2.5 million for the Housing Investment Fund. $750,000 to maintain women's, what have traditionally been the winter shelters, but to maintain those shelters year-round. $300,000 for landlord recruitment and retention. And finally, a little bit over $1 million for intensive street engagement around some of homeless camps in the city. Next on the list, there's $960,000 for the Youth Bus Pass, again, to continue the city's commitment around the Youth Bus Pass. $1.9 million for the indoor track and field event, which is coming next year. And then again, these other mayor's decisions, which I'll quickly go through, many of them are a pretty small dollar amount. But again, around Ban the Box, $100,000. This is not a position, but this is around communications and outreach around the Ban the Box. $75,000 for a consultant to assist the city on our ongoing Superfund discussions. $26,000 for the hearings office in the auditor's office. Again, this is something that council's recently had on its agenda to again reduce the costs and have the general fund pick up the costs of some of those hearings. Within the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, 3 packages, Central City Plan, again, limited term staff to make progress on that, continuing efforts on Salmon Safe certification, and then $318,000 single family development code, again, limited term staff for that project as well. $37,000, again, outreach on the outreach and enforcement on the protected sick time policy the city passed. As the mayor mentioned, $46,000 for City Hall technology, which would include a sound system. $135,000 for summer interns. I don't believe all $135,000 of that's summer interns in the mayor's office. I think that's a citywide, but again, our summer internship program. Within the Office of Management and Finance, $140,000 for a franchise auditor within the Division of Revenue, and also $480,000 to continue the IRS data exchange program. And both of those, I believe, are projected to increase revenues to the city in excess of their cost. Within the Office of Neighborhood Involvement, $440,000 for 3 marijuana permitting positions as marijuana legalization ramps up. $120,000 for a mental health specialist, and $86,000 to support the New Portlander Policy Commission. Within the Parks Bureau, again, outside of the things that were mentioned above, $250,000 for Gateway Green. That's a matching fund on a grant. Again, you'll see that offset of the $500,000 for operations and maintenance, because that won't be needed until future years when those parks are in service. $250,000 investment in Parks for New Portlanders. $98,000 for additional patrols, or to pay for patrols at River Place Marina. $130,000 for summer free-for-all, which again I think still may be one of our serial one-time funded programs, and $190,000 for Symphony in the Park, which again the city supported for a number of years on the one-time side. Within the Bureau of Emergency Management, $45,000 for the Beacon program, $56,000 for continuity of operations, and yes, those are the two within the Office of Emergency Management. Also within PBOT, separate from the packages I mentioned up above, $60,000 for Safe Routes to Schools. That's the entire request is for $300,000. This is a portion of that. Within the police, again, on the one-time side, there's a little bit more for the Domestic Violence Restraining Order team of $78,000. $60,000 for the GIFT program, and $30,000 for the Rosewood Initiative. And then within special appropriations, $400,000 for the 3 to PhD. This is the program between Concordia and Fabian Elementary School. Fabian, excuse me. $5,000 for the CUB bill inserts that we've sent out since we brought CUB on board, the Citizens Utility Board, to help with oversight of our utilities. $500,000 for the psychiatric facility, and finally $300,000 for river access, which I believe would create a beach over by the Hawthorne Bridge on the east side of the Willamette River. And then Gateway Legal Services funded at $120,000, again, to expand those legal services to more days than are currently being provided. And finally, Southeast Works, which is, again, another serial one-time funded item at $40,000.
Questions?
I have a question. What about the Office of Equity and Human Rights position for mental health, not mental health, for administration at the COAB? Was in ONI, it got moved to equity. I don't see it in either of the columns.
The COCL administrative position is in
It's all within the DOJ.
Yeah, so it shows up the DOJ
It's in the
agreement
DOJ.
on the ongoing
Okay,
side,
thank you.
1.2 million, yeah.
A couple of questions. Let's start with the Auditor Hearings Office. That may be a modest number, depending on the true cost of implementing the auditor's proposal of opening the doors wider for people to get administrative hearings. If the actual exceeds 26,000, Mayor, is your intent just to seek those additional funds out of contingency?
So, yeah, Sarah's here. Maybe you can explain that estimate a little more. We heard that in the presentation with the auditor and Greg, but.
Good morning, Sarah Landis, Auditor's Office. The $26,000 is just the general fund portion of our ask. There's another $30,000 that would come from overhead. Those dollars just offset the interagency agreements that we have with bureaus for code appeals and enforcement hearings. So it is not an ask for new dollars or for new capacity for the hearings office. That request will come after we're able to gather some data, should our legislative proposal pass in the upcoming weeks for the notification and appeals issues.
So one of the things that the legislative proposal requires is uniform notice provisions across all bureaus, letting the public know that they have the right to appeal an adverse decision. Or I think we can all predict there'll be more appeals, particularly since we're reducing the cost barrier. So your intention would be to collect some data and come back to us in one of the bumps if you need additional general fund support to fund the program?
That's right. And right now we have a little bit of additional capacity in terms of hearings officer, part-time hearings officer work available that we're currently hiring a hearings officer for and intending to use that and our contracted land use hearings officer more than we have in the past so that we can free up our full-time hearings officer to hear these appeals.
Well, I'd like to start by expressing some appreciation for this budget, Mayor. There are a number of things here that I've advocated for, including Out of the Mud and the Youth Transit Pass, so thank you very much for those. If I could ask for one more thing, it would probably be full funding for Safe Routes to Schools. But my question goes to the new capital to PBOT, which is a wonderful thing. In the Our Streets conversation, we had a pretty deep engagement with the community and arrived at a split between maintenance and safety of just over 50% for maintenance and almost 50% for safety. I'm curious if we took the two big PBOT lines in one time, the street paving and Capital and Southwest Corridor, and slice that the same way between maintenance and safety, do we know what that split would look like?
I don't offhand. I know the commissioner looked at this a little bit.
To be honest, I can't remember exactly. I mean, obviously it would be several $1 million more for safety and several $1 million less for paving. And I actually did suggest that we try to divide up the dollars that way. CBO will confirm this, but frankly, the resolution saying that 50% of the one time has to go to maintenance of one kind or another made the math a little tricky.
Although I think it's fair to say that the improvements, for instance, on 122nd, although their maintenance will also provide a lot of safety improvements.
Well, actually, 122nd, it's two different pots. There's pure paving plus $4+ million that will go to safety, access to transit improvements, which I am extremely excited about. But yes, and actually, it turns out the next year it might be difficult to spend more than that on 122nd itself, just sort of practically in terms of getting the work done. But I would agree that ideally I would like to have a split that's closer to the 56-44 that we talked about.
Can I follow up on something Chris mentioned on the $60,000 for Safe Routes to School? What specifically will that fund out of the total ask?
Glad you asked, Commissioner. The total ask was for combination of things: engagement with over 10,000 school youth and the development of the Bureau's Vision Zero implementation plan, specifically middle and high school youth, creating bike clubs at Title I middle schools in North and Northeast Portland, which provide field trips and education for students and culminate with students earning fully outfitted bikes, helmets, and repair supplies they can use to commute to school and in their neighborhoods, and support for 2 Opal Environmental Justice youth organizers to work in high schools, supporting transportation needs assessment, leadership development, and transit education. I believe the $60,000 was only for the Opal positions.
Oh, okay, now I'm in stereo. Yeah, exactly. I need to start with appreciations too. This budget is really, there's a lot of spending in East Portland and on very concrete things. So it's wonderful, Steve Novak, that you championed East Portland, and I much appreciate that. And I thank you, Mayor Hales, for continuing that and making it almost the centerpiece of your budget. It's wonderful. I think that in a year or two, when you can see rapid transit, I think is a technical term, but frequent bus trips on 122nd, it's going to make a lot of difference for a lot of people. people that you probably won't hear from, but it will make a big difference. And there's, I have, and the other thing is I just wanted to thank you too for the no drama inclusion of the East Portland Action Plan into the budget. Thank you so much. And I do have a few questions.
By the way, Katie, right back at you. If you recall, thanks to the good advocacy months ago, you got 5 council members on record as saying they wanted to accomplish that. And last I checked, while 3 gets you to the finish line, 5 is even better. So there was some very good lobbying on that issue.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and not all, yes, done by many people. But I do have a few questions, well, actually, some more kudos. I think the DVRO team is a wonderful idea. And I often think of that when I read the paper and I see some horrible incident. And that the horrible incident is the one that makes it into the paper. And there's a lot of other things that need to be handled. One of my questions is the summer interns. How are they chosen? Is that high school or is that college?
The
135,000.
it's high school, and they're allocated out among the bureaus.
Okay. So I'm just hoping that that is done in a way that includes all of the city schools and is done thoughtfully and using criteria that will ensure that kids that are, it's funny because I raised kids in far East Portland, and they were like somewhat scared of downtown because they live so far away from it. And it's really funny how that influences, those small things will influence kids. And so I hope there's outreach to the East Portland schools. And I want to
flag one thing there, and that is happy about this budget proposal, but there's still some gaps that we need to note. One is that I have proposed continuing the youth bus pass funding, but so far that only covers Portland Public. Oh, why don't you turn your mic off for a second, and then I'll let you have yours back. That only includes Portland Public Schools at this point. I would like us to move to a model in which all the kids in the city got access to the transit system on the same basis. One reason this is in the one-time column is that the legislature has created is creating a working group in the interim to look at this issue of how do they support school transportation in all the different kinds of districts of the state, which includes very urban ones, not just Portland Public, and then very rural ones where they have to use yellow buses. So that issue is still in flux, and we're not where we should be. The proposal for enhanced youth access to the community centers includes free Saturday nights at Dishman, Mount Scott, East Portland, and what am I leaving out? Dishman, Mount Scott, East Portland, and Charles Jordan we already have. What's the fourth one, Mike? Montevilla, thank you. And also includes some funding for partners who might be able to do things like provide transportation services. So we'll try to close that access gap for those free Saturday nights at all those community centers, and for the summer being free at Dishman, and for the Montevilla being a youth center. We'll try to close that access gap for kids that don't have a youth pass, and obviously none of them has a youth pass during the summer. So we're sort of partway there with this proposal, but we're going to need our partners, assuming the council approves this, move back to more free and available recreation for teens, which is where we were in the Charles Jordan era. If we move back to that model, I'm going to be going, and I know Commissioner Fritz is eager to do this as well, going to all of our partners in the nonprofit sector and other public agencies and saying, okay, the city's making this commitment. We are stepping up for free and available recreation for teenagers, but we need you, United Way or David Douglas School District or Friends of the Children, to step up as our partner and do this, to partner with that. And the transportation piece, at least until the legislature works out that issue about youth passes, is going to have to be a piece of that.
Well, thank you. Yes, I wasn't even going to bring that up because it's been hashed over so many times, but I'm grateful that you're looking at that and we're continuing to work on that. There was one thing that I did want to, it was kind of like okay, guys, You're spending $6 million on housing. Housing is a big issue. And a lot of people are struggling to find housing. And a lot of this money is going towards displacement prevention in North and Northeast Portland. And I said this before, but I just have to say it again. It's a lot more expensive now. And if you work on displacement in East Portland now, it will be a lot cheaper. So there's going to be more coming out of East Portland around displacement, and I just want you to think about that. And then, no, I think this is a really good budget. Thank you.
Two questions, I guess. One, they both relate to overtime expenditures. The parks, the special initiative on keeping the centers open, is that going to be keeping them open until curfew, like 11 or 12 at night? And I guess, is it involving overtime? And if so, how much overtime is part of the $2 million?
I can see
Mayor, Commissioner, Michael Bate, Director of Parks. The community centers on Saturday nights and Friday nights will be open till 10:30, and it does involve overtime for rangers, but for staff, this is an ongoing request, so we expect to add staff to be able to accommodate that.
Although it should be noted that the cost of those staff is currently under discussion, so that the proposal will change over time, I believe. I think the number is the funding, but how we're going to be able to staff it is questionable. And so actually I wanted everybody to know that in the ongoing request, I'm going to be suggesting to remove the $73,500 ongoing for two seasonal maintenance worker conversions, so that we have more flexibility, not only with this program for the mayor's community center funding, also with the ongoing discussion of how we're going to be able to pay parks workers across the board $15 an hour or more. So it seems unwise to allocate that money to those two specific positions at the time when we're going to be having discussions over the next year about parks funding in general.
So to sum up, the only overtime expenditure is for parks rangers in this current proposal?
That's correct.
Okay. And then my other question related to the indoor track and field meet, how much of the money, if any, is going to pay police overtime?
Vin's here, and Doug, I think the answer to that question is a little, but Gail, do you know how much is going into police overtime, or maybe Doug? Yeah, there's a security portion of it, but some of that's police and some of that's not.
Good morning, Doug Oblitz, representing Portland 2016. The actual budget for police services being worked out right now with Captain Vince Elmore. We're looking at the overall budget for security, which will depend in great part on the security threat that's determined much closer to the event right now. So the overall budget for security that we proposed in the city budget is about $500,000. That includes security both outside the venues and inside the venues. So some of it is private, some of it is public, and the split between those two will be worked out.
Some of that public could end up being overtime, right?
That's correct. This event will occur all day long and into the evening, so there's a possibility that some of that will be overtime.
So of the $500,000 budgeted for security, you said $300,000 is for private, $200,000 for public?
Roughly right now, $300,000 is the public side, but that number is in flux still until we determine the actual needs of the police bureau versus private side security.
Okay. And well, I've got you here, Doug. I represent the city on the Travel Portland board, and we had a meeting yesterday, and as of yesterday, there's still been no reservation for the convention center for the indoor track and field meet. How can that be?
The agreement is nearly complete right now. In fact, we just received a nearly final draft of that, so that should be done within days.
So within the end of this week, you'll have reservation for the convention center?
My understanding is the agreement is nearly complete. There's a few red lines going back and forth between Tracktown USA and OCC, nearly complete.
Following up question for either Dan or Doug, what's the total budget for this event, and how much is Travel Portland contributing to the event?
The total budget right now is about $12 million, and that number actually has increased since the time that we did the economic report that we reported on here on April 22nd. I'm joined by Vin Lanana from Tracktown USA and Michael Riley, who's the Chief Operating Officer for Tracktown. And the total budget now is about $12 million. That includes the addition of the USA National Track and Field Championships, which will occur in Portland the weekend before. And so there has been some increases. It also includes kind of the current up-to-date thinking about what's going to happen at Pioneer Square and at the Moda Center, which are the two other major venues for this event.
What has Travel Portland committed to in terms of your budget?
We have an application going in, I believe, for the Visitor Development Fund, I believe it's called, and we've been working with Kathy Kretz at Travel Portland to put that together.
How much are you seeking?
We're seeking whatever the full amount is. It's my understanding that that decision gets rendered by them and comes back to us as to what they allocate.
They testified in support of this item at one of our budget hearings and said that, and highlighted the fact that it will bring a lot of tourism here, it'll fill a lot of beds, it'll do a lot of things that Travel Portland is actually charged with doing. So what's the amount that you're going to be seeking from them to offset some of your costs?
We understand the limit that is able to be asked is $100,000.
Why is there a limit of $100,000?
I don't know. That's what we were informed of when we filled out the application.
Well, Commissioner Saltzman and I serve on the board, and Commissioner Loretta Smith also indicated that she would be interested in some more funding. So that's something that I think we need to look at. Maybe we could put this in as a placeholder. Obviously, that's not going to be resolved before we have to approve the budget. What I would suggest we do is put in a budget note that should any additional funding come from Travel Portland or elsewhere, that this money would go into contingency.
It's worth noting that, and I don't know when this happened, but I think, Dan, you'll correct me, a few years ago, we actually took action to substantially boost the resources that Travel Portland gets, and they now have an additional $4 or $5 million a year to do things like marketing and other useful services. Given their enthusiasm, appropriate enthusiasm for what this event will bring to Portland, I just want to make sure that there's a fair allocation of costs, because they are, in fact, the lead agency for these kinds of things, and we want to make sure they're full partners.
Just to add to that, I mean, when you look at the line items for the event, there's some things that I think are, which we're really looking forward to. And I mean, I grew up around Eugene when pre was pre, and Oregon was known as the premier track and field place in the world, which I hope we still are. But when you look at the line items here, there's some that I think are easier to justify as public expenditures than others. The security is something that cities provide. The Pioneer Square activation and the sponsorship for youth engagement, I think those are very defensible. Things like the host city sponsorship and the broadcast sponsorship are things that I think sound like the kind of things that a visitor development fund should be paying for. So I think that I would hope you're able to break down line item by line item what we should, and then hopefully can get more than $100,000 from the Visitor Development Fund.
Well, first of all, my name is Vin Lanana. I'm the chairman of the local organizing committee. Thank you, Mayor Hales, and our commissioners for all your vocal support and all of the things that you guys have done in terms of listening to the requests and in supporting this great global event. I think that maybe providing a little context for it, because we appreciate your suggestions of how to get the funding for this. I will say that this is as we know, a transformational opportunity. It's a once in a lifetime. It's a global event. And it's more than just a track meet, more than some of these things that are here, budgets of $12 million, in which we do have a gap in that budget of somewhere around between $4 and $5 million. In order for us to be able to make these things happen and have it be not just a track meet or two track meets, bookended, but basically a celebration of all the values that we believe the state of Oregon and the city of Portland really embrace. So we will accept all of your suggestions and all your recommendations to go back and seek out, whether it's Travel Portland or wherever else it should be, and we will do our best to be sure that we make that, that gap close so that we can present to the world the best, what we believe is the best place in the United States to host this event. So appreciate your commitment to it and appreciate an opportunity to be here today.
Sounds like we've got not only goodwill, but voting membership on an important committee. So appreciate this discussion. Let's follow up on what the parameters actually are. I can't imagine that they are ironclad at 100,000. Given the significance of the event and the relevance to the Visitor Development Fund, seems like there ought to be more skin in the game than that, particularly.
And I think, Mr. Mayor, there's a couple of areas. One, we're working with TriMet on a transit pass program to make sure that our visitors have access to our transit program. As you can imagine, the connections between Pioneer Square and the Oregon Convention Center couldn't be more perfect. And we really want to encourage as many of the participants and visitors to the city to use that as the main point of connection. But our transit pass program runs through this, through Travel Portland as well. And the other issue is just overcoming kind of the usual formula that Travel Portland uses to determine how much money should be put in is based on hotel rooms and number of visitors and so on. So we'll need the help of the council members to push on that as much as possible.
Of course, we have the benefit of being the principal source of their funding. So we have at least an opportunity to have that discussion. And I was struck when they came out and testified at our budget hearing that they are among your biggest boosters in terms of what this means for Portland, what this means for our brand, for tourism, for filling hotel beds, and that's typically what they help invest in. So I think they've made the case as eloquently as anyone about maybe lifting that cap.
That people have been to some more?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First, isn't it refreshing to have a budget where we're actually looking for the things that weren't funded as opposed to the things that were? When I first came on board a few years ago, that was the super cuts budget where we were building up from zero for everything, and that was quite the contrast with this year. So, you know, this is the wood I'll knock on, but I like this new atmosphere of not scarcity. Anyway, one thing I was wondering about was in the police packages, one of the ones that wasn't funded was the body-worn camera system implementation. And I was just wondering, is that going to be covered a different way? Or, I mean, they're going to have to do that. So
forward 846,000.
Right, but they asked for an additional 227.
And I think if I got this right, the conclusion is we know we're going to need more funds, but we don't know how much more.
So
and we're waiting for the legislature. In fact, I'm going down to testify on Thursday. We're waiting for the legislature to get the legal issues resolved about how we use body-worn cameras. We've got some money in the account to start the program, and we know we'll need to spend more, both in terms of servers to load the data and people to manage all that. But until the legislature tells us what data has to be stored for how long, it's still a question mark. So we've got enough money allocated already from the previous decision by the council that we can certainly get started. I think I've got that right, Andrew. Is that, yeah.
Okay. I figured it was something like that. Thank you. And then the other thing is, so I'm active in my my neighborhood district association and through them in Northwest, which is where I live. I keep getting reminders about how ONI didn't get the money that they were asking for, specifically related to diversity and civic leadership program, neighborhood small grants, youth program, disability program. They were asking for some additional funding in that area, which part of the reason I brought up that contingency earlier is they're not asking for very much in some of these programs, and it looks like there's still a little bit at play. But I noticed overall, looking at the budget, that it does seem to reflect a priority that moves away from this using the city as a granting organization. I was wondering if these decisions were sort of part of that overall philosophy, or if there was something else going on.
Yeah, I think that's a good discussion topic for us as a council and as a budget committee. What I've tried to do over these three budgets, and there's a lot of agreement, I think, on the council about this, is one, keep moving things that are ongoing commitments and expenditures from one-time column to ongoing, get real about that. And we're almost there. We've still got a few items, I think that most of us would say, that's an ongoing expenditure. We ought to move it over into the continuing column. Focus on basic services, which we certainly have done in this budget proposal. And then special appropriations ought to be truly special one-time things. The indoor track and field championship is a classic case. And the psychiatric emergency facility capital commitment is a classic case. And there are times where it's appropriate for the city to be a grant-making partner. I think the 3 to PhD project between Concordia and Portland Public Schools is so catalytic in its effect on the kids in our city that, just like the David Douglas pilot project at Earl Boyles, it's appropriate for the city to be a grant-making partner in those kinds of community ventures, but we also ought to be wary of being a grant maker. And in contrast, by the way, the county board has a policy of never making any such grants, and they have a surplus that's roughly the same size as ours. So that's one of the discussion topics between us and the county over the next few years as well, is who takes on these community ventures? What's the policy at each government about being a partner? But we've tried to keep shortening that list of special appropriations to things that truly were one-time, unique, and appropriate. There's judgment involved in each of those, but I think as a general policy, that should be a short list.
Okay, so.
And Rob, I just want to point out two things. One, ONI is receiving about $1.1 million and 6 new staff, as part of the proposed budget for a number of different programs, marijuana permitting program, the East Portland Action Plan, and other things.
None of which are on their priority
But
list.
I actually wanted to point out, because I think it's important for people to realize, ONI did not formally request the funding, the sort of the right budget for ONI. It did not come in as a decision package, nor will you see it in here. It was put into a memo, which puts it in what I would, as the budget director, categorize as an informal request that they wanted to put out there. But again, it was not formally requested, and again, is not funded.
And the reason for that is because ONI followed the mayor's budget guidance or requirement that they would have to propose a cut in order to be able to fund an ongoing request, and there isn't anything left to cut. I will second your motion that it should be funded. In fact, it should be now $230,000 for ongoing for ONI, and that's my highest priority in terms of adjustments. The reason it should be 230 rather than 200 is because the proposed budget includes funding for a new diversity and civic leadership partner, but at a level which the current partners say is unsustainable. So the right budget for ONI included an extra $30,000 for each of the current 5 partners. If we're going to fund a new partner, which I believe we should be funding them at a sustainable level rather than at the lower level. So I agree with you that if we're really focusing on equity and on outreach to underserved communities, that's a high priority.
And I guess I would just sort of, to snowball even further, talk about a little bit about how ONI is sort of something that's, I think, a little bit unique to Portland and really works great. And I think that, the small grants program, these are actually going out to neighborhood districts and doing really great work in citizen engagement. And it's in terms of the size of the allocation we're talking about, this is a relatively small allocation, and I think it has a big payout. So anyway, I would just sort of speak in favor of that.
So I guess, just in the spirit of this discussion, I am puzzled why there was a mental health specialist in the Office of Neighborhood Involvement. I can't quite find a rhyme or reason for that.
I can explain this. It's a support for the members of the Community Oversight Advisory Board. It's part of the DOJ settlement agreement funding. As I mentioned, or as became clear, the other position to provide support for the Community Oversight Advisory Board has been located in the Office of Equity and Human Rights. The decision was made to put the mental health specialist in with crime prevention specialists as part of the programming. It's debatable whether it belongs there or in the Office of Equity and Human Rights. But the point is that people experiencing mental illnesses need particular help in order to be able, or particular accommodation in order to be able to participate in something as stressful and overwhelming as the Community Oversight Advisory Board. And so that was the rationale for creating that position.
So this is to provide mental health support to members of the Community Oversight Advisory Board?
So you can think of it like a translator. If we had a member of the Community Oversight Advisory Board who did not speak English, that we would be needing a translator for that person. For people with mental illness, experiencing mental illnesses, which can be cyclical, at times they may need accommodation in order to be able to help explain what's on the agenda, to be able to participate remotely if they happen to be in the hospital at the time of the meeting. There are various supports that are needed by people with ongoing mental illnesses that we don't currently have the expertise. So it's not prescribing medications or doing therapy or anything like that. It's simply the logistics and recognizing that people experiencing disabilities may need particular accommodations and particular assistance.
I guess if we have one of these people in Office of Equity and we have one in Office of Neighborhood Involvement, it seems like a little bit overkill. I mean,
They're two different positions. One is providing support for the COCL and the COAB in just logistically in setting up the meetings, doing the minutes, those kinds of things. The other is specifically to help the members of the community to provide accommodations for the members of the Community Advisory Board.
So Mayor, technically, I mean, just to go back to, I guess, the admonition, we're not deliberating, but we're the first phase of this was to shine a light on your proposed budget, give the council an opportunity to ask questions, make sure we understood the items. My understanding is the next phase is for you to announce any adjustments that you plan to offer based on what you've already heard up until this point, and then to invite your colleagues to address any, to foreshadow any amendments or any adjustments that they have on their list for sort of discussion at a high level, because again, we can't deliberate, but with the hope that then over the next few days, we could continue those conversations and see if we can get to a consensus budget.
Correct. And I plan to take in what we've discussed here, take in the testimony we hear tomorrow at the public hearing, and file a set of small adjustments based on all that with the proposed budget when we file on Thursday for council documents for next week. So again, other amendment proposals can still come in after that, but I would encourage people to try to communicate with me, so if I can get it into an omnibus package, I'll try.
Are there, Mayor, there's certain issues you're going to take off the table today just so that they aren't on anyone's list and are not subject to further debate? Or you want to
I don't think I should do that, given that this is a work session, so yeah.
I have just a follow-up comment to Commissioner Salzman. Maybe a better analogy would be the navigators that you have at the Gateway Center. That's kind of the specialized assistance that this position is intended to provide. I also wanted to announce to folks and to the public that I have sent around memos regarding the positions that I had been requesting as ongoing funding from the general fund in both parks and development services, 2 positions for the tree code, which we are, in light of the challenges that we have in providing sustainable wages for parks workers, we're proposing to fund those from a reserve fund in the urban forestry program. Those would be funded from the urban forestry fund for 1 year and then hopefully changed to permit funded for ongoing. So I'm withdrawing that request. I'm also asking an amendment to the development services request from the mayor's proposed budget, that he had proposed taking money from the land use services reserves for both the land use services positions, the 2 positions in land use services and the several positions in the neighborhood inspections program. BDS and I get very concerned about mixing and matching different reserve funds. We have specific reserve funds for each of our programs. And so again, we're proposing to fund the neighborhood inspections, both the enhanced inspections and the extremely distressed properties from the nuisance inspection, from the inspections program reserves. That would be for 1 year. I hope I have commitment from the council that these are that they're very important positions, and that we'll be coming back with another request or an ongoing look next year.
Appreciate that. Just want to, again, thank you, Commissioner Fritz, for those clarifications, and it is, again, important for each of us to not just look at this proposed budget overall, the $3.7 billion, the $49 million of new revenues that we're allocating, but also look back into our own Bureau budgets and propose those kinds of reallocations if you see fit, so that we can make those adjustments in the final adopted budget as well. So I'm working on one or two of those in PDC. Appreciate you doing that in BDS as well, and just want to encourage us all to do that.
So I have a couple of other comments, if I may. I do support the $118,000 for the paralegal position, having seen how helpful those can be at a lower cost than a full attorney position. I think that would be wise and prudent if we were able to find money for that. I have a question regarding the $100,000 for one-time money for Ban the Box outreach, and I'm wondering how that compares with our outreach money for sick time, and including the BOLI contract. So I'd be interested, not now, but coming back, if you could get me that information. I don't think we had anything like $100,000 for sick time implementation, and so with lessons learned on how to do that, that had to outreach to absolutely everybody in the city because all employees are covered as well as all employers. The Ban the Box might be a slightly more targeted outreach to employers for sure, but also to returning citizens. And so I'm wondering whether $100,000 is necessary. Similarly, there's the $37.5 for protected sick time allocation, which I appreciate, Mayor, that you're continuing to provide some support to my office for that added work that we're doing. It's touch and go whether it's going to get passed through the legislature this year. I don't know if anybody's following it, but it's probably one of the more interesting and thoughtful discussions that's happening at the legislature. So there's a possibility, again, that that won't be needed, and I would request a budget note that if it isn't, that money go back into contingency. I want to note that the Symphony in the Park is not a parks request. It's really a special appropriation. And similarly, I'm questioning the river access being a special appropriation. Where was your thought as to who would be running that process?
Good question. I mean, that could be, it will have to be most likely a joint venture between parks, perhaps PDC, and at least those two. Yeah.
That was what I thought. So maybe putting that in parks and putting this Symphony into special appropriations. It's a matter. Doesn't matter all that much. I appreciate the money going, but just to be clear,
Can I just yield on that point? There is a third bureau that does have a particular interest in the river, and that's the Bureau of Environmental Services. We've not yet been briefed on this issue. We are doing a lot of habitat work, restoration, river stuff, so we'd want to see if we can line up on that one. And also there's a lot of permitting issues, as you know, Mayor, that are implicated whenever you do this. So at some point, we look forward to getting the briefing and then seeing what if any, value we bring to this.
Just a quick note, the beach access actually is in the Parks Bureau budget. We just did not update it on this spreadsheet. So it is in, the river access money is in the Parks Bureau budget. It was moved, we just didn't catch it on this sheet.
My understanding is it's not yet decided how that money is to be allocated. It wasn't a parks request. So it was added, in fact, in response to community testimony, which is cool to see when citizens showing up does make a difference. So I appreciate your point, Commissioner Fish, that certainly BES needs to be involved in that. I want to make sure that the money for VOS, which was missed out of the Portland Development Commission money, gets added back. That's $30,000. I am continuing to be concerned that our special appropriations that go on contracts don't have cost of living involved in them. So this is the same, what they're asking for is the same as last year, but eventually I think we need to look at the policy for that. And then there was one other thing which I've forgotten, so if anybody else wants to leap in,
I'll jump in. One of the virtues of this process, Mayor, is we're actually daylighting some of the conversations we'd be having privately with you, usually on bended knees with tears coming out. But we're going to get a chance to sort of put our cards on the table here, and I think that's probably good for the public to see us how we manage the end game. I applaud the pillars of this budget, and I applaud the priorities. And I think, and I was asked a few days ago, I think of all the budgets that I've seen a mayor deliver in my tenure on the council, I think this is one of the most thoughtful and intentional budgets we've had. And I think the communication strategy around the budget has been superb. You would think less of me if I didn't ask you to consider increasing the HIF, and I'll make the case. I'm delighted that a little over 10% of our bounty is going to housing. I think that reflects an important value system. The reason that I think we should increase the HIF, though, which is the Housing Investment Fund, is that you have set some very bold goals in terms of new construction, and ultimately we're not going to dig our way out of this hole unless we add more units. And the challenge that the Housing Bureau has is that the dollars they currently use are heavily encumbered. So as we've learned in the course of looking at how to boost production, we know that TIF, tax increment finance dollars, can only be spent in 15% of the city. So that does not help us address East Portland, east of Lents. And we know that the federal dollars come with lots of strings, which have the unintentional effect of raising the cost of construction, just the compliance issues with the federal dollars. So Commissioner Saltzman has been leading on this idea that with a locally funded pot of money that has fewer restrictions and can also be used in a nimble way, addressing projects as they come up, gap financing, grant financing, even revolving, that we can be opportunistic in this marketplace, acquiring and holding land, providing gap financing for projects in the pipeline, and promoting innovation. $2.5 million is a healthy down payment. I don't want to diminish that. And the overall allocation for housing is, I think, strong. I would argue that if that we give serious consideration to matching the county's contribution, so we start with $10 million. And there's no logic to $10 million other than it is something that the city and the county have said would be an aspiration. The additional unrestricted dollars gives us another tool, again, that's flexible and allows us to build more units. So that's one. Number two is a couple of years ago, we asked all bureaus to take a 10% haircut, and that at the Regional Arts and Culture Council had a pretty significant negative impact on what they call their project grant program. Last year, we in a more challenging budget environment, we continued the RAC grant. This year, we've taken the $250,000 out of the budget altogether. Let me make a case for reinstating it. 200 of the $250,000 funds the project grants. This is separate from the other grant making they do and entirely separate from the grant making that's funded by the arts tax. There are two reasons to like this program. One is it funds emerging artists and smaller groups that for whom up to $6,000 makes a difference. The second is that it is the biggest diversity play at RAC. That is the largest number of minority and women artists who are seeking to get a foothold in their careers access this pot of money, which makes a difference in nurturing careers. It's $6,000 with a ceiling. It's met a lot of the values that RAC has established. $200,000 of the $250,000 goes to project grants. I think it's been a successful program. I would argue that that since it is not backfilled through the arts tax, it has its own standing. The other $50,000 is $25,000 for Right Brain and $25,000 for Work for Art. I think those are valuable programs. Right Brain is getting great success, and the additional funding this year from all pots will allow more schools to participate. $25,000 isn't going to make or break that program. $25,000 for Work for Art would go on top of about $200,000 by contract we give RAC for Work for Art. $25,000 isn't going to make or break that program. I think the $200,000 for the project grant program is a significant loss, and so I would argue that that be reinstated. I strongly support $100,000 for the Rose Festival, and I join with at least one of my colleagues, and perhaps two, in supporting the right side, the additional funding for ONI.
Thank you. Appreciate those points. Let me actually respond to a couple of things there, because I think, again, makes us go back and all do some homework. Couple of things I'm thinking about, and I think we all ought to think about. This budget has risen because of improved economic conditions. Although we budget with the forecast we have, to paraphrase a notorious statement that came out of the White House once, we budget with we forecast with the budget we have, so we don't know what the fall bump will be. We don't know what next year's budget will be, but I believe that the economic conditions of the city mean that this won't be our only budget in which we are strengthening what we do rather than thinning it. And I like that too, Rob. So I guess I would urge us not only to keep the eye on the big picture of the overall budgets, because it's not 6 million we're putting into housing, it's 100 million that we're putting into housing. And then also think about some other trends. One is private sector leverage, private and nonprofit sector leverage. I think it's incumbent on us, if we make this commitment in parks, as I said earlier, to go out and ask the private sector to step up. I think the same thing, frankly, is true in the arts. I've been to a number of arts organization fundraisers this year, and the economic conditions are blessing them as well. I'm very proud of my wife because she was one of the co-chairs for the symphony fundraiser. They had a goal of raising $400,000 at their annual event, and they raised $700,000. The same thing happened at Artists Rep. I think we're seeing, the arts organizations able to go to their fundraising base and do more, and we need to ask them to keep that up because the community needs them. Another issue, and it really bears on the housing question, Commissioner Fish, and that is, I think we each need to go back to our bureaus, as I need to do with the police bureau about body cameras, and say, we want you to do this. There's 365 days in this year. How far are you going to be by halfway through the year or all the way through the year? I'm pushing PDC, for example. As you may recall, in my State of the City speech, I was trumpeting the fact that they'd finally issued RFPs for and gotten developers selected for 4 parcels out of the many pieces of property, 30-some that PDC owns and lends. Great, let's get things going at Lentz at long last. I'm now pushing them, and they're responding, but it takes time, to get those projects into construction before the middle of next year. So there's the question for Commissioner Saltzman and the Housing Bureau is, as we give you, the Housing Bureau, more resources, what is your capacity to actually get those dollars out the door in committed projects where the money has to be spent this fiscal year? And from my experience with PDC, it takes longer than any of us would like to go from budgetary decision and council direction to actual expenditure and construction. So we need to look at that trajectory question of, we're serious about more housing. The county's going to give us more resources. Thank you, Chair Kafoury, for your proposed budget, assuming that they pass their budget. We're committing more resources to housing. We've committed additional tax increment funds in some of our districts to more housing. What's our capacity to actually get those projects in the ground? And as you can tell, I've got some energy about that issue, and I'm pushing the agency I work most with, the PDC. But I think that's a question for all of our bureaus. Okay, the council's making this budgetary commitment. Go. You got 365 days. Tell me where you're going to be on day 200.
Yeah, let me, this is a great discussion. This actually doesn't happen when we're having our private conversations, because right about now, one of your aides comes in and says you have another meeting. So, we have a chance for a longer discussion. So I totally agree with you in terms of prioritizing the whole housing budget and looking what you can get out the door. I have a slightly different view of the HIF, which is, I think it's uniquely a fund that you endow with one-time money. And if I had the power, I'd put $50 million in it, endow it. And even if we couldn't get the money out the door, I would then charge, I think the council would charge Dan with finding unique and innovative ways of getting that money out. But we don't have, this is a history-making opportunity to endow it. That's it. And once it's endowed, particularly if it's recycled, it actually doesn't have to be replenished on the same regular basis. To your point about the arts, and I wasn't going to say anything about Symphony in the Park, because I know how near and dear this is to your heart. But the reality, and I think every mayor gets to have a symphony in the park. But the reality is, under the arts tax, we now provide 3.8% of the symphony's base budget. So we have actually done exactly what you've said, and 3.8% towards a goal of 5% of operating support through the arts tax. So I would respectfully say for them it's double dipping. But I think a mayor has a right to pick an event, even though I think we should be careful about picking one event over another event, because you might like the symphony, I might like, dance or the opera. But the reality is we are providing more operating support for the big institutions through the arts tax, and that's what the public said they wanted that arts tax to do. We're at 3.8%. What we are not doing is providing the seed money for the struggling artists who aspire someday to be established. And that's why I think both from an equity play and from a kind of a seed fund concept, the 200,000 for RAC has proven its worth time and time again. That's just the only distinction I would draw.
Could we ask RAC to reprioritize?
So, every time we discuss budget issues, particularly around the arts, the question comes up, well, could RAC reallocate money, do it? And I actually think at some point we should just fund a performance audit, track all their dollars, their positions, so that we don't have this at an anecdotal level, because obviously as the liaison, I will give you the cup half full. You might have a different view looking at staffing and numbers. But I think we need better science on that. The only thing that troubles me is that I think it's a better practice to give someone lead time to have that conversation rather than to do shock therapy. And so if the view is that you want to replace one funding stream with another over time, my preference is you signal that and then create a pathway. And that includes sitting down with them, looking at their existing programs. Their budgets are heavily prescribed, sort of like housing budget. But I can't sit here and tell you for sure that Eloise could take a savings here and move it over here or cut a program. Remember, every program they've got has a constituency and typically had a champion in this building urging them to do it. My preference would be give them a softer landing and then have the discussion about how to allocate their overall budget. Again, understanding that as the arts tax receipts improve, we are meeting the goal of providing a better contribution to the established arts groups. I want to make sure that the emerging arts groups are also getting a hand up in our budgeting.
Just a few comments. One is that I just wanted to say that I will be incredibly grateful if this council approves a budget that has this kind of level of investment in transportation. Not only would this budget pay for very much needed paving and safety work, I think it will also give us a lot of credibility with the public. In our conversations about transportation funding in the community this past year, we heard a lot of people say, if transportation is such a priority, why don't you dedicate more general fund to it? And frankly, they had a point. So by prioritizing transportation in this general fund budget, I think that we will buy a lot of credibility with the public on the general transportation funding issue. I do have a concern about not funding all of the 26 firefighter positions ongoing. We cut those positions 2 years ago. Fortunately, we were able to extend them because of a grant, but we cut them when we were in budget cutting mode. And now that we're not in budget cutting mode, I am concerned about the message I think it sends to the firefighters to not fund them all one time. And I don't think that anybody intends to cut those 13 positions next year, but I think that I would like as many of us as possible to make it clear that we do not intend to do that. I will not reintroduce the amendment that I offered last year to cut the Drugs and Vice Division because I want to get my one loss record and 3-2 votes to a better place. But I still think that investing money in work that's not the combination of drugs and violence, but strictly trying to get drug traffickers, particularly drug traffickers, is an investment in the ongoing war on drugs that's been a failure for 40 years. I want to just give a heads up about a possible contingency request that PBEM might have. There's a state grant we get every year, the Emergency Management Performance Grant. We were told 2 months ago we'd expect the same funding that we got last year, which is $385,000. We were told 2 weeks ago, no, you might get $207,000. We've been going back and forth with the state for the past couple of weeks, and we think that we'll get most of that back, but we could be asking for something in the neighborhood of $50,000, and the state won't make the decision until next month. So just also, I think maybe we should give a shout out to the business community because it's largely the increase in business taxes that is allowing us to have a better budget. So I think that it's a shout out to all of our we should give a shout out to all of our profitable businesses.
supported by their city council over the course of the recession. So, and I want to comment on your firefighter issue. I know that the chief is working very hard on looking at alternative staffing options and the rapid response vehicles and what they do. And so I do think that having forcing another conversation next year of what does our fire bureau look like ongoing is a good strategy. So I support the mayor's allocation. I remember the other thing that I wanted to bring up, and that is the Oregon Rail Heritage Foundation building that I know is a priority for Commissioner Fish. The request had been to allow SDCs to forgive the loan. The challenge is that it's not a building that the city owns, so we're not allowed to use SDCs on system development charges for properties that the city doesn't own. So I would make that request as a general fund ask. It's a one-time forgiveness, and it actually will, they're wanting to pay off the previous loan so that they can start on another capital expansion. So we could either forgive the loan or put a down payment on their next capital expansion, which provides educational resources.
I just want to thank you, Commissioner Fritz, for putting that on the table. The Oregon Rail Heritage Foundation rescued 3 soon-to-be homeless steam locomotives that for historical oddity reasons we own. I think we've owned them since 1958 or something. One of them was the SP 4449, which was the engine which led the bicentennial train across the country in 1976. They were to be homeless. A group of citizens stepped up and said, here's the deal, we'll raise over $5 million, build a facility, and handle all the stuff if you partner with us. We'll own and operate the facility. We won't charge the public anything to come see your treasures. So I deeply appreciate, Commissioner Fritz, you putting that issue on the table. We structured it as a loan at the front end because that was the available dollars, but the goal was at the end, if they met their target, to try to give them some relief. And I would hope that this becomes a framework for all other partners where we say if you can raise that kind of money to solve one of our problems, we'll help you with the last dollars so you're not encumbered as you seek another round of fundraising. Their next fundraising project, as I understand it, would be expand capacity within the building and do some things which again would make it more beneficial to the public that gets access for free. So I would second that, Mayor, and urge that we prioritize that.
Thank you, Commissioner. With it being close to onset, have you been to the Rail Heritage Foundation Budget Advisors? It's really a very fun place, even for. Have you been to Chris, have you been to the Rail Heritage Foundation and visited our trains, your trains? I mean, when I was describing this to somebody at the Conomox Park opening on Saturday, I said, these are your trains, you need to go see them. And they really are quite spectacular, and you get to go right up to them. So I think it's a great project. So I would suggest that a building that houses our assets is really a higher priority, perhaps, than some of the other special appropriation requests. Particularly, I'm concerned about helping to fund the psychiatric facility. That's a legacy project, although it's certainly something that our police will potentially find helpful in helping people with experiencing mental illnesses. It doesn't expand the capacity of the inpatient beds, and it is a privately run facility. So if we're looking for scarce dollars to provide assistance for capital improvements, I would suggest that's a place that perhaps we could lower the amount to that legacy facility and fund the Rail Heritage Building.
Just one quick anecdote, Mayor. My wife has a friend who lives somewhere in the state of Washington, and we went to their house for dinner, and the spouse was retired, and it turned the entire house into a hobby, which is model engines and cars, and it really quite extraordinary, and the entire house practically. And the prize of his collection was the SP 4449, which apparently, to scale, is quite a desirable engine.
Mayor, like Commissioner Fritz, I forgot one more thing I wanted to mention, which is we've been criticized for doing any special appropriations, and I think that we should be very careful and judicious with them. One that I'm very proud to support is the 3 to PhD appropriation. There's been a debate raging about education policy in this country for the last 15 years, and there's one camp that says that the only way to improve education is to fire a lot of teachers. but serious researchers who have looked at countries around the world that supposedly have, allegedly have better education systems, have found that it's not that they fire lots of teachers, it's that, among other things, they take teacher preparation very seriously. And one of the criticisms of a lot of American teacher preparation programs is that they don't involve enough practical experience. And what Concordia is doing here is making sure that these teachers in training get hands-on practical experience in a school right on site. And I think that's exactly what should be happening in teacher education. So I'm very proud to support that.
I follow up on that for a sec. There is an ask in this budget cycle which is not funded, and that's the College Ready ask that we heard something about. Recently, I went out to Gresham High School and saw it in action. They had some AmeriCorps students. And it reminded me a little bit about a similar program we invest in is through Cash Oregon, we invest in tax preparers for low-income families to make sure they qualify for the Earned Income Tax Credit. And so it's an indirect way that we access a bigger pot out here. It struck me that the genius of the College Ready program is in coaching low-income kids, many of them first generation to go to high school, first generation to go to college, facing other barriers. We're opening the doors of opportunity with a fairly small investment, hoping that they get into the college of their choice, and then with education have opportunities thereafter. I know it didn't make your budget this year. There's been a tradition, Mayor. Last year we invested in David Douglas. This year, 3 to PhD, which I enthusiastically support. I would hope that the message back to them is that good ideas percolate a little bit in our budget, and that each year we pick one that's a winner. And I would say my early favorite for next year is College Ready, given what I saw. And I hope all my colleagues get a chance to see them in action. But maybe the message back to Ken Thrasher and others is you have our attention, it just doesn't make the cut this year.
Well, let me mention something that I want us to do as a council, and that is we get deeper into some of these issues in the budget process than we do during the rest of the year, sometimes as a council, even though one or more of us may be working on it. And there are some big picture topics that I want us to have these kinds of work sessions where we have staff and resource people available to us that are non-budgetary and non-bureau specific, but end up having a big effect on what we do, or in fact bear directly on bureau programs in some cases. One of those is infrastructure funding. We have a parks infrastructure funding problem, we have a transportation infrastructure funding problem, we have a public facilities infrastructure problem, which we may be addressing in part with our Portland building plan, but it's not the only problem we have. So that's a big picture topic we've got to address. The legislature and the Congress may or may not do anything this year about transportation funding, but we know we have to. We know we have a giant maintenance and capital investment need in parks. The SDCs will cover some of that, but nowhere near enough. So I want us to work as a board and as a body on that issue and to bring in people and discuss those in depth as we, again, sometimes do in the budget process. Another one's the housing affordability. And you're making a very good case for why we need to invest in the HIF, but what do we as a community do to address the housing affordability issue in policy? Again, we're waiting on the legislature on a couple of topics. In policy, in regulation, in fees, and in investments. I think we need to take a big picture look at that issue because it's a community crisis and it deserves our attention. Another one, a little more remote, but nevertheless, I think we make the connection, and that is education and workforce. We have a role in the workforce issue. We do some of that through PDC. We do some of that through partnerships. There are things that are working in the community on that issue, and we all believe the 3 to PhD model, just like the Earl Boyles Early Learning Center model, is a good prototype. I think it is appropriate for the city to support those prototypes, but there's some things going on in public education and workforce development that are really great, and we ought to figure out how we partner with them better. I was just at the groundbreaking at Franklin on Saturday for their renovation. I was stunned by the statistic there, just like I was heartened by what I heard at Roosevelt. The graduation rate at Franklin High School is now 85%. For African American students, it's 92. What are they doing at Franklin that we need to do in the rest of our school system for kids of color? I want to know, and I think you do, I bet you do too. So we need to have those policy level discussions on issues that bear very directly, like infrastructure funding, and that involve partnership like housing and that involve leverage and partnership like education and workforce. So I want to, after the budget season is over, schedule a sequence of these kinds of discussions where we get down into that level of depth, and some of us have particular expertise and things to bring to that table, and people we'd like to hear from.
You know, Mayor, the lore is that former Mayor Vera Katz loved the Tuesday work sessions, and Betsy Ames told me there were quite a lot of them. My sense, having served with Mayor Adams, was he hated them, so they were very rare. Maybe you can bring the pendulum back, so somewhere in the middle, because my own experience with these work sessions at the bump, this budget, and other times is that it does allow us as a group to go deeper into subjects and have these kinds of conversations, which we just don't have the opportunity otherwise. And so I applaud your inclination there, because I think we do some of our best thinking as a group together. We can't make decisions, but I think this is hugely valuable, these kinds of sessions.
Other topics that you think ought to be on that list, please.
I had one other follow-up on Commissioner Novick's point about street paving. And this gets back to sort of earlier conversations about the long-term ramifications of not making improvements where they're needed desperately now to the streets. And I'm just wondering, and maybe somebody from PBOT, if not the commissioner himself, can answer this question, how much in sort of future savings is the city getting by paving these streets now when they're still pavable, rather than reconstructing them later if we had not spent this money now? This is just something for, I want citizens who live in Portland to understand that the decision making here is actually saving the city tens of millions of dollars.
That's an excellent question, and I wish I knew off the top of my head exactly how many lane miles we were going to be paving in the 3 paving projects we're talking about. But if you can do grind and pave projects, which these will be, they range between like $100,000 per lane mile to like $400,000 per lane mile, then you avoid having to rebuild the street entirely, which is $1 million to up to $4 million per lane mile.
So I wish a 10 times multiplier.
It can be close to that, yes.
So you're looking at the $9 million that's being spent now for street paving, potentially saving the city in somewhere in the range of $75 to $90 million if we had not done this work.
Well, at a minimum, I would say that 30 million, and it could be a lot more than that.
Other, Kate, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think this was a valuable meeting, and and I also want to put in a plug for having your citizen advisors be a part of the entire year of budget events, which would include the bump sessions, because that way you're really getting the citizens looking at the budget through the whole year, and so there's no like gap where people go, oh, they're putting together deals, deals under the table or whatever. And under the table is the wrong term, because that sounds more underhanded than I mean. But anyway, the point is that I think it's good to have us here if you think so. And but it's better if we're involved through the whole year.
Thanks for your amazing volunteerism. Hopefully your 2 colleagues didn't want to jump you and say, stop, don't say it. Because if you're all willing to spend more time working with us, we value your advice.
Yeah, I would just echo Katie's remarks. I think in past years, we would go through the process with the bureaus and provide our input, and then the mayor's budget was a little bit of a black box to us. We typically got 1 meeting with the mayor, but I think daylighting it here at least gives me an important sense of closure, and that we've got the last stages of it finely tuned. So thank you.
Chris, I'm a little disappointed. I don't think you've referenced the Portland plan in this meeting. Would you like to correct the record?
So I commend the mayor and Commissioner Fish, and I certainly supported having this work session. I think it sets a new standard for our budget process, having this. It's the first time that we've actually had our budget advisors come back and say, well, what did you hear and what do you think of the mayor's budget? Just so you know, I think it's designed. The mayor's proposed is kind of a black box for a little bit for the 2 weeks where he's putting it together, and that's okay, as long as we then have this session where it's out in the open as to what's commendable, which is the vast majority of it and which tweaks are most important to each one of us. So I appreciate the Budget Office and all of you for participating, and I certainly agree that having you involved in the bump discussions. The other piece that I will make sure that I do is getting back to my Bureau's budget advisory committees after the budget to make sure that they understand that they were heard, that they were valuable, and here's what the council decided and why. I think many of us, we accept that we won't always get what we want. We need to understand that it was heard, considered, and why the decision went one way or the other. So thank you very much for participating in this.
So just a reminder on logistics. So again, and the mayor at the end of this will continue the budget committee. We have the hearing, as I mentioned, tomorrow night here at 6:30 in council chambers. We will be filing the approved budget, which will be heard next week on the 27th. We'll be filing that with the mayor's office at the end of the day, Thursday. So I think any of those sort of additional conversations that need to happen in advance of that filing. And then I think, as the mayor requested, amendments by Monday. And again, the city budget office is happy to assist any of your offices if you do have amendments, so we can make sure the language is accurate.
Well, thank you all. This has been a very helpful session. And again, Andrew, to you and your team, thanks for all the hard work. And we'll see you tomorrow at 6:30. We are continuing the Budget Committee meeting until 6:30 p.m. tomorrow.